beginning to discuss another issue about the Lachmei Toda, and this is going to be on page Chaf, on the right column, next to the last paragraph. Yotza lechem echad chutzim uchitzasa. Now we're talking about the psul of Yotze, which applies in the case of Lachmei Toda if it leaves the Azara. And in this particular case, before he shechted the carbon Toda, one of the lechamim left the Azara. So the requirement is that we bring it back into the Azara so that now the shechita of the carbon Toda could be makadesh the lechem that was outside of the Azara, because as we said yesterday, it's an all or nothing proposition. We have to be makadesh all the lechamim, 10 of each of 4 species. In yotza bein hashchita lezrika, what happens if at the moment of shchita, this lechem of the Lachmei Toda was outside the Azara? However, after shchita, there was kabbalah sadam, holacha sadam. Now he's ready to go in for zrika sadam. So now he could do the zrika sadam for the purpose of the zevach, and we'll see what zevach in a minute. And that will be mekadesh the lechem, not through shchita, but rather through zrika. So when we say that the Lachmei Toda are defined as an accompaniment of the zevach, and therefore the zevach is mekadesh the Lachmei Toda, then the kiddush process could be one of two. It could either be through shchita or possibly through zrika. However, in this case, since at the moment of shchita, we didn't have all the Lachmei Toda, the entire quantity of Lachmei Toda in the Azara. Now what we do is we take the carbon Toda and we downgrade it, so to speak. Instead of the zrika of the coin being a zrika for the purpose of Toda, now the zrika will be for the purpose of shlomim. So Toda has a membership card in a more generic category called shlomim, as well as a specific membership card in the category of Toda. But in a case where the shechita was not capable of being mekadesh the Lachmei Toda because the lechem was outside the Azara, now what happens is the avodas hakarbon gets downgraded from the specific to the general, to the generic. And now it becomes a carbon shlomim. I mean, we can compare it, if you recall, to the first Mishnah in Tzvachim in a case of Shalol Lishma. So let's say, for example, you remember we had the case where he shechts an Ola L'Shem Shlomim, and the carbon is not Ola L'Bailim. It's not a carbon Ola, but it belongs to a sort of more generic status as a Zevach, which might be Shlom. Here too, if the Shechita was not done in a way that it could perform and function properly in the world of, in the specific world of Lachmei Toda, but nevertheless it could drop down to a fallback position of being an avoda of a carbon shlom, which is the generic category of Toda. But what does that mean in terms of the lechem? Well, if it's a carbon shlomim, then abasar yachel achal lechem pasul, and lo yotze bailam yidei chov. Whenever you have a carbon Toda, which is brought by one of the 4 people, 4 categories of individuals who experience the salvation, if that carbon Toda, transforms itself into a generic carbon shlomim, then the Bailam have not fulfilled their obligation to bring the specific carbon, the complexion of which is that of a Toda. They'll have to bring a replacement carbon Toda. And furthermore, since now the carbon has been transformed from a toda, downgraded to be a shlamim, the lechamim are possible because those lechamim were lachme toda, and here there's no toda because the lechem was outside of the azar at the time of the shechita. Now we get to a third case. So we had case number one was the lechem was out before the shechita. We just simply bring it back in. Case number two is he shechted it and the lechem was outside the azar. Now the carbon goes downgraded to be a carbon shlamim. And now we have scenario number three. Yotza li'achar shenizrak adam. So the shechita all the way up to the zrika was perfect, was ideal. The lechamim were there in the azar. Now, after the zrika, the lechem was taken out of the azar. In such a case, Orem me'al lechem, he's chayav in truma, as we said, 1 out of 10 of each of the 4 species. If he has enough lechem to deliver to the Kohen that has not been taken out of the azar, so there's no psul of yotze in minimum one of each of the 4 species, the 4 meaning, and then he can be mekayim the mitzvah of truma with that lechem. And now you ask me, does the Bala carbon have to bring a replacement carbon, or has he fulfilled his pledge? And the answer is he certainly has fulfilled his pledge, because the avoda sakarban was an avoda kshera from shchita till zrika of lachme toda bifnim inside the azar. Those lechamim that went out of the azar he cannot eat; they became possible. But as far as his obligation vis-a-vis toda, he fulfilled his obligation. Now we get to another case. Nitma ben shchita l'zrika. The lechem contracted tumah after the shchita, before the zrika. If it was before the shchita, just replace it with another lechem. But now he already implemented the shchita. He hasn't yet gotten to the point of the zrika, and nitma lechem. Then, once again, what's going to happen is the carbon toda is going to take on a generic personality. It's going to become a carbon shlamim. It can no longer be a carbon toda because the zrika cannot be a zrika for the sake of the lechem. The lechem is tameh, and therefore it's invalid. So now the law is the following. The carbon takes on the dinim of a shlamim. The basar should be eaten. The lechem is possible, and he has to replace it with another toda. Lo yotzi dechol basar. However, nitmali achar shenizrak adam. All the avodas from shchita and up to zrika, including zrika, were done behefsher, and the lechamim were not tmeim; they were all tahorim. In such a case, yorim me'al lechem. If he has enough lechem tar, that means 1 full loaf from each of the 4 species, he will give that to the Kohen. B'yatzi yedei nidra. And even though he may not have the lechamim to eat because they are tmeim, but nevertheless the avodas hatamid was ol l'shem tamid, and therefore he fulfilled his obligation. There's no need, and he's not even allowed to replace it with another toda. And now we get to the Shitas HaRambam. And this is the Rambam quoted here in footnote Shin and Dalit, Psulei Mikdoshim, Perek Gimel. Rak im nifras echad me'alechamim nifsolim kol alechamim, vel nitma o yotza echad me'am shar alechamim ksher. The Rambam says something revolutionary. He says that when does one problem spread? You know, we say, I don't know if you're familiar with the phrase. Do you have such a phrase that one bad apple spoils the bunch? Yeah? Okay. I thought that was like a New York thing. Even in the Midwest, they say it, right? Okay. So now we say that if you have isolated one problematic lechem, then the entire enterprise and all the other lechamim contagiously are possible. The Rambam says, no, that's not really true. It's only true in one particular case, with regard to one particular psul, which is called nifras. You remember that the chiyuv of truma to give to the Kohen requires that I give a sholem, a complete whole loaf. Or with a W, not a holy loaf without the W, because that would be like nifras. But I give a complete loaf to the Kohen. If it was already sliced, then I have no choice, but I have to throw out all the lechamim. However, let's say one of the lechamim contracted tumah, or one of the lechamim became possible because of yotzei, then the Rambam holds that all the other lechamim are ksherim. And the question now is how to understand that Rambam, that very, very unique Rambam. So we'll begin with a sefer, one of the commentaries on the Rambam called the Kiryas Sefer, and then we'll go on to the Kesef Mishnah. The Kiryas Sefer says that the Rambam is discussing a case of Kodem Shchita. And what does that mean? That this group of 40 lechamim is one entity that cannot be divided up into its segments. And if one of these 40 lechamim was nifras, then all the 40 lechamim are possible. But it's before shchita. And therefore just replace these 40 with another 40 and you're fine, you're good to go. So that's called nifras echad mihem kodem hashchita. Aval im nitma o yotza echad mihem hashar ksherit. So the Rambam is saying that when there's a halacha of a certain problem that came up and arose before shchita, and now you're going to have to replace the lechamim, and the Rambam says all the lechamim, it's one entity. That's only with regard to the psul of nifras. But if it was a psul of nitma or yotze, then put a red mark on those lechamim that contracted tumah or were taken outside the azor. Replace those marked lechamim with new lechamim that are tar or were in the azor and never left the azor, and then go ahead and do the shchita. There's no halacha, according to the Rambam, in the case of kodem shchita, that it's an all or nothing procedure, and if there's a bad apple, it spoils the whole bunch. That only applies to nifras, but not to nitma or psul yotze. And that's the shita of the Kiryas Sefer. Is olav lahavi acher, v'rak tachas oso lechem shenifsa. And now we're up to the Kesef Mishnah. That's on the top left column of page Chav. The Ram is referring to shchita or zrika. We're not going to limit it to shchita the way Kiryas Sefer did. And here, nifras echad, kulam psul. Aval yotza echad, achirim hashak sherim. Why? So for this, we really have to be experts in Kodshim, and we have to know about the laws of Zrika and the Psul of Yotzei. And since at the time of the Shechita, all of the Lechamim were inside the Azara, and none of them were sliced, so we don't have the Psul, that contagious Psul of Nifras. So let's say one of the lechamim left the azor. So the Rambam says that in such a case, we have a principle, which I'm borrowing from Kodshim and applying it here in Lachmi Toda, that Zrika is meaningful even for Yotzei, which is called Zrika Mo'eles Af Ala Yotzei. So the zrika, which contains within it the power of kapara, is effective even for yotze. Again, we can't evaluate that without really knowing Kodshim very, very well. Meaning that even though one of the lechamim was tameh, became tameh between shchita and zrika, nevertheless, all of the lechamim are ksherim. Did I say nitma? I meant to say yotza. So one of the lechamim between shchita and zrika, one of the lechamim was yotze. They're all kosher. All the lechamim, even the one that was yotze, because of this principle called zrika mo'eles liyotze. V'chein. Oh, now we get to the case of nitma. Nitma echad al-lechamim between shchita and zrika. Azrika matira es halechem. Now you're going to ask me, wait a minute, we have a principle that zrika is mo'eles ala yotze, but we never found the principle that zrika is mo'eles ala tameh. But the answer to that is that the Kohen Gadol is wearing the tzitz, and we have halacha that tzitz is maratz ala tumah. The avsheino matis halechem atameh atzma b'achilu. You can't eat that lechem that contracted tumah. But mikolakom who moel that tzitz is meaningful. Le'inyan sheyischashev zrika sadam kizrika al kol halechamim afal atameh. And therefore, the carbon as a toda is kosher. All the lechamim can be eaten with the exception of that lechem that contracted tumah, because the halach of tzitz maratze is not matir the basar, or in our case, not matir the achila of the lechamim. And now he quotes the Brisker Rav, my Rebbe's own. Af l'shita zu. Even according to this interpretation of the Rambam, sheshar alechamim ksherim im yotza echad nitma, mikol makom eino yotza yedei nidro, mishum shebefoel ein kol halechamim nitarim b'achilu. Now, again, I'm going to just present the Brisker Rav. I don't know whether I can definitely get excited about it, but he's claiming that according to this second sheet of the Kesef Mishnah, he would have to replace the zema. Now, this is very strange because we said the zrika is mo'eles liyotze, and we said that sits maratz ala tumah, and therefore I would say that he has a full-fledged carbon toda. Says the Brisker Rav, no, that's not what the Kesef Mishnah has in mind in the Rambam. What he has in mind is that there's no psul on the lechamim. Let's take the case of yotze, because the zrika is mo'eles liyotze. In the case of tumah, we're going to say that he can't eat that tameh, but yet the carbon is kosher because tzitz maratz ala tumah. But the Bailim have not fulfilled their obligation. And if I understand the Brisker Rav correctly, he's saying that the obligation of the Bailim depends upon these 40 lechamim. He brought the zevach together with the accompaniment of 40 lechamim, and now part of these lechamim are not kosher, so to speak, for this carbon, because they contracted tumah. But I don't understand. He's assuming that the same thing applies to yotze. Okay, that was just simply not, I didn't know one way or the other. So let's assume it applies to yotze. It certainly applies to tummy, that since maratz ala tumah is not matir the achila of that which is tummy. And if he can't eat all the lechamim, and now the Brisker Rav says that applies to yotze as well, that when we say zrika is moel ala yotze, that's only to save it from being puzzled, but it doesn't allow you to eat the lechem. It's machshir the one, but nevertheless he hasn't fulfilled his obligation, which I think the Brisker Rav means that his obligation is a twofold obligation. It's not just to bring a tzevach odom, but to bring 40 lechamim, all of which can be eaten. I don't know. It's very radical. I'm afraid, unless I see it inside, I'm afraid to say something. He says, "Any yotzi they nidra," and that means he has to replace it. And I believe he's talking about a carbon chova of our bod street from lahodos. Now, the first hoda was yotze, what was qualified as a carbon toda. So he's already fulfilled his carbon toda. Now what? He's going to bring a second carbon toda just for the sake of the lechamim? I'm missing a piece of the puzzle. He tells you to look at Chidushia grids. I don't have access to that. Okay. Now we go on to another dimension of Lachme Toda, and that is what's called Vlad Toda or Tmuras Toda, which is kind of a group that's usually classified together. Toda Sha'avda. Here's the case. He was mafresh a carbon Toda and he got lost. The animal flew the coop. V'hifresh acheres tachpel. V'achach nimtza. What happens? They found the original carbon toda, but he was already makdish the second replacement carbon as a toda. He's going to have to bring two carbonis as a toda. And what about the lechamim? So he says, Afsheb lechol elu krevim b'toras toda. Both now have to be brought as a carbon toda. Enam to unim lechem. Let's see the post. Shekei nemar v'hikriv al zevach atoda chalos matzos atoda to uno lechem v'lo vlada v'lo chilufa v'lo tmurasa to uno lechem. So I think what he's saying here is that he doesn't have to bring two todos, each of which will be accompanied by 40 lechamim, but rather the first toda, now that he found it, he relocated it, that will be accompanied by 40 lechamim. But the second one, that was a replacement, that's called tmuras toda. And with regard to tmuras toda, there's a special xeris hakos, special miut, that tells me that tmuras toda do not require lechamim. So that the tmura, which means the replacement in this case, does not require lechamim. So, like, this is a very interesting quiz question, that you would ask a scholar if you were testing him on menachas. You would ask him, what case is there where a person brings a carbon toda and you don't have any lechem to accompany? Which is counterintuitive because the essence of a carbon toda is to be matir the lechem. Lachmei toda. And if you're not bringing lechem to accompany the toda, you're missing a major chunk in the toda. How could it be, this is the quiz question, that you would bring a carbon toda without its 40 lechamim accompanying? And the answer is tmuras toda, which means that the first toda was lost, and now we replace it. We found the original toda. The replacement toda is called a todas tmura, or tmuras toda, and the Torah excludes tmuras toda from lachmei toda, because the Torah in lachmei Torah says vehikriv al zevach hatoda chalos matzos, and we're interpreting that pasuk to mean that only the toda, the real McCoy toda, requires chalos matzos, the accompaniment of lechem. But any sort of spin-off of the toda, for example, the tmuras toda, designated to replace the Toda remains a second string Toda, and the nafkamina is that there are no 40 lechamim to accompany. And the same halacha applies to Vlad HaToda. So you have a carbon Toda, which is designated, now it gives birth to a Vlad. The Vlad has a din of Vlad HaKodshim and has to be brought as a carbon, but without any accompaniment of lechamim, because the Torah says that lechamim apply only in the real McCoy Toda. Al Zevach HaToda, with a Hey Ayidiyah, does not apply to the Vlad HaToda. Then we have Tmuras Toda. Let's say a man looks at another animal, which is chulin. He's got a carbon Toda here on his right, chulin on the left, and he says, Harei zu kizu. And in such a case, he violates a law of Tmura, but on the other hand, the second carbon, which is the Tmura carbon, is chal. And it is a carbon. But it doesn't have the status of lachmei Toda. Now we have a case of Vlad Todas Chova. Yigon Sha'omar Harealai Toda. Who adin li echad mi'arba hachayavim lahodos. Okay. I mean, that seems to be a simple shot. Todas Chova. I don't know why he says Arei Alai Toda. Im nishchat li achar shekarva imo. Eino ton lechem. Nishchat kodem shekarva imo ton lechem. So the question of whether or not is a chiyuv lechem in the case of Vlad Toda depends upon when the shechita took place. You've got the Vlad of a Toda, you've already shechted the mother, that's the Ikar Toda, and not only that, you were makriv it, so you completed the entire process of akrava vis-a-vis the original carbon Toda, which is called the emo in this context, and now you're bringing another carbon Toda from the Vlad, because Vlad Todas Chova is also a Toda, but since it was shechted after the akrava of the mother, it doesn't require lechem. So what he's saying is that the potential is that even in the case of Vlad HaToda, the Shechita could engender a din of Lachmei Toda, requirement of bringing Lachmei Toda to a company. But that's only because it's still in the ballpark, so to speak. You know what I mean? It's in the bullpen maybe, but on deck circle. Because you haven't yet been makriv the Ikar Tamid. So as long as you haven't yet been makriv the Ikar Tamid, halacha of, and the requirement of Vlad HaToda upgrades the Vlad HaToda to a full-fledged carbon Toda that must be accompanied by 40 lecham. However, if the entire akrava process of the mother Toda, the Ikar Toda, the original Toda, has completed itself, then the Vlad HaToda comes under a new category. And that category is excluded from Lachmei Toda. So again, everything depends upon the shechita. The moment of shechita will determine, and I'm talking about the vlad, whether or not that vlad requires lechem or doesn't. If at the moment of shechita they have not yet been makriv the mother, the ikar carbon toda, then you have to accompany it with 40 lechem. And everything depends upon the shashchita. If the akrava of the imo was already implemented, already complete before the shechita of the vlad, then the shechita of the vlad is a separate entity, a separate chiyuv of toda without any lechem. Okay, so this is where we'll stop here. Let's just make a note of where we got up to. And tomorrow, Mr. Hashem, we'll start a new topic. We just have to finish up a little bit on Lachmei Toda. That will do Be'ez Hashem.